Leonardo da Vinci is one of the greatest minds in history, ahead of his era. Many of his ideas were so revolutionary that even modern technology was not immediately able to realize them. Leonardo's flying machines, the dream of the sky. The 15th century, no airplanes or helicopters, and suddenly a man is trying to create a machine that will allow him to take to the sky like a bird. Da Vinci dreamed that one day people would be able to conquer the sky. He had been fascinated by flight since childhood. He watched birds, studying how they spread their wings and rise into the air. These observations inspired him to create a range of flying devices. Da Vinci believed that by understanding how birds flew, it would be possible to create a machine that would allow humans to do the same. One such invention was his famous air propeller, a prototype helicopter. At first glance, the idea seemed simple. The propeller should rotate and lift a person into the air. But Leonardo had one drawback. In his time, there were no engines. Da Vinci planned for the propeller to be spun by hand, like a huge corkscrew. This helicopter looked impressive on paper, but in practice it wouldn't take off. A human would simply not be able to develop the necessary rotational speed to take to the sky. Interestingly, when scientists examined the drawings of this propeller, they realized Leonardo's idea, despite the difficulties, was extremely advanced for its time. In fact, many of the principles of helicopter engineering that are used today come from his writings. But even this great mind could not overcome the limitations of his era. However, this did not stop Leonardo. He continued to dream of flight. The next step in his quest to master the sky was the creation of a parachute. The parachute that Leonardo drew was a huge pyramidal device. He believed that if a man jumped from a great height with such a device, his fall would be slowed and he would land safely. But, as with the helicopter, Leonardo was unable to test his parachute. It was left to speculation whether this bold idea would work. And so it took almost 500 years before someone decided to test Da Vinci's parachute. It happened in 2000 when British skydiver Adrian Nicholas dared to jump from a height of several thousand meters using a parachute based on Da Vinci's drawings. And the parachute worked. This historic jump proved that Leonardo's ideas were indeed ahead of their time. Although the modern parachute is more comfortable and safer, the principle itself, plus, was correct. Now let's look at it from a different perspective. Leonardo, who lived in an era when people could not even imagine flying on airplanes, was able to foresee such inventions. But what drove him to think such thoughts? Perhaps it was a desire to challenge nature and prove that human capabilities are not limited to the Earth. And that brings us to our first conclusion. Great inventors don't always create devices that work, but they set the direction of progress for centuries to come, as Da Vinci did, offering the world ideas that became reality centuries later. And the second unconventional conclusion: some of humanity's greatest ideas don't need to be realized in their own time. They were created to inspire the future. After all, even Leonardo's failed helicopter became the basis for future discoveries, and his parachute, although it was not tested during the inventor's lifetime, showed the world that sometimes dreams really are ahead of reality. Military inventions. How Leonardo tried to make wars safer. Do you think it would have been possible to invent weapons that were meant to reduce destruction rather than make it worse? Leonardo da Vinci was a genius, but his attitude to war was different from most of his contemporaries. Although he created blueprints for war machines, his main goal was not to increase destruction, but to limit it. Moreover, da Vinci tried to make warfare safer, but his methods were unusual. Leonardo lived in an era when wars were brutal and bloody, and despite his aversion to violence, he often worked for warlords. They needed new ways to win battles, and Leonardo could help them do that. However, as we know from his writings, he didn't like inventing weapons at all. He believed that mankind was abusing its intelligence for destruction instead of using it to create. One of his most famous military projects was a tank. But not the kind of tank we're used to. This tank was more like a giant turtle, a huge spiked armored machine designed to protect the people inside and destroy everything in its path. On paper, it looked like a machine from the future, capable of dramatically changing the course of battles. However, like many of Leonardo's inventions, the tank was too complex for the time. Leonardo made a drawing of the tank in 1487. It was a circular structure with sloping walls and cannons around the perimeter. Inside were men who had to twist levers to turn the wheels. But here was the problem. The men couldn't both drive the machine and fire the cannons at the same time. The mechanism was too impractical for its time. Today's tanks are driven by sophisticated electronics and powerful engines, but there was no such technology in the 15th century. Now let's imagine, if such a tank had been built, how would it have affected the war? Perhaps its armor would have protected the soldiers, and battles would have become less bloody. However, the technology of the time simply did not allow this to happen. Leonardo conceived a machine that was ahead of its time, but it proved too complex for real life. Nevertheless, the very idea of creating an armored vehicle to protect people is revolutionary, and centuries later, tanks became an integral part of wars. Leonardo often left intentional errors in the drawings of his military inventions. Why? Because he didn't want his ideas to be used for destruction without his control. For example, in the blueprint of a tank, he made the wheels move in opposite directions, making it inoperable. He deliberately inserted mistakes so that his designs could not be implemented without him. This move shows how much Leonardo hated violence and distrusted those who could use his inventions for selfish purposes. Such actions by Leonardo lead to an unconventional conclusion. Brilliant inventors do not always strive for the full realization of their ideas. They can put moral barriers in the way of their use. Leonardo chose to leave his blueprints idle rather than see his machines bring death and destruction. Another interesting conclusion is that many innovations, even those that are ahead of their time, can remain only on paper if society is not technologically or morally ready for them. Leonardo realized that his world was not yet ready for such revolutionary changes and left these ideas to the future. But that's not all of Leonardo's amazing military designs. He also designed machines that could destroy fortresses and even swim underwater. The submarine, an invention that Leonardo did not want to realize. Leonardo da Vinci was not just a brilliant artist and engineer. He had a deep understanding of human nature. One of his most mysterious and dangerous projects was a submarine, which he purposely did not realize for fear of its consequences. Submarines are a familiar part of the modern world, but in the 15th century it was pure fantasy. However, Leonardo was developing an idea that could allow a person to move underwater and breathe while doing so. According to his drawings, this submarine looked quite simple. It was a wooden structure with a system of breathing tubes that came to the surface. These breathing tubes were supposed to allow people to stay underwater for long periods of time. But why did Leonardo need to create an underwater device? The answer is that it was a weapon. Leonardo conceived of this boat as a tool for underwater attacks. In his mind, a small submarine could swim up to enemy ships and stealthily destroy them. But here is where the fun begins. Despite the fact that he developed working drawings, Leonardo refused to build this boat. There is one very important phrase in his notes that explains his decision. "I do not want my inventions to lead to the destruction of the world." Leonardo realized that if such technology fell into the hands of people who were not afraid to use it for evil, it could lead to terrible consequences. At the time, wars were fought on land and sea, but underwater attacks could make them even more brutal. Da Vinci refused to give mankind this instrument of destruction. This act shows an unusual side of Leonardo. He was not just an inventor who wanted fame and success. He realized that his inventions could be used for destruction and suffering. This brings us to our first unusual conclusion. Brilliant inventors do not always strive to realize all their ideas. Sometimes they abandon them because they realize their danger. Leonardo, like other great minds, viewed his inventions in terms of how they would affect humanity, not just in terms of their technical genius. Interestingly, many inventors of later centuries did not have this moral responsibility. They developed weapons that could destroy entire cities and did not think about the global catastrophes that would result. Leonardo, on the other hand, foresaw that the submarine, if built, could be a vehicle for stealthy attacks that could change the course of war and lead to even greater destruction. This move shows that the greatest discoveries can be more dangerous than they seem at first glance, and wisdom lies not only in inventing them, but also in abandoning them in time. However, even though Leonardo decided not to build a submarine, his ideas still inspired the future. The primitive shape of the submarine he designed was later realized in later models. In the 19th century, the first real submarines began to be used for military purposes, and they played a significant role in naval battles. Many modern inventions are based on ideas that Leonardo developed in the 15th century, but he was one of the few who realized that technology is not only progress, but also responsibility. So, what else was Leonardo hiding in his notes? It turns out that this was far from the only project he abandoned. There is another invention that could have changed history, but it remained on paper. Leonardo's robot, the first humanoid mechanism. At the end of the 15th century, no one even thought about robots. At the time, people were just beginning to develop mechanical clocks and simple devices. But Leonardo da Vinci went the furthest. He created the blueprints for the first robot. He designed a mechanical man who could move. It was a true marvel for his time. But why did he do it? And what became of this project? Leonardo da Vinci was a man who was interested in everything from anatomy to machines. His robot represented a knight in armor. This mechanical man could sit, raise his arms, move his neck, and even open his mouth. Da Vinci created it to show that mechanics could be used to mimic human movements. It wasn't just an experiment, it was a real revelation in the world of technology. Centuries later, in the 1950s, scientists discovered his blueprints and decided to test how plausible Leonardo's ideas were. They built his robot from these old blueprints, and guess what? It actually worked. Leonardo's robot was able to move, turn its head, wave its arms, move its legs. This was something incredible, considering that the blueprints were already over 500 years old. The mechanism that Leonardo developed was so complex that it can rightly be considered the prototype of modern androids. Today, androids can do complex actions, walk, talk, even dance. But the principle of their work is very similar to what Leonardo invented. He used simple mechanisms like levers and gears to make his robot mimic human movements. It wasn't just a machine, it was a true embodiment of his vision of the future. And this is where the question arises. Why did Leonardo create this robot? Perhaps he wanted to show the world that mechanics can do what at first glance seems impossible. Or perhaps he envisioned a future in which machines would become human assistants. Either way, his robot was more than just fun or a game. It was a step into the future we see now, in a world of robots and artificial intelligence. Genius ideas can be born in any era, but only time can show how far ahead of their time they were. Leonardo designed a robot in the 15th century, but its mechanisms were so complex that it took hundreds of years for the world to truly appreciate the invention. Technologies that seem like science fiction today may become commonplace tomorrow. Many of Leonardo da Vinci's ideas have been forgotten for centuries, but his legacy lives on and inspires modern engineers and scientists. He dreamed of a future in which man could overcome the limits of the possible.